This is how the 12 apostles of Jesus died, and where they're buried. Pay attention because each death is stranger than the last. Let's start with Peter, known as the first pope of the church. He traveled through Turkey preaching and eventually ended up in Rome. Around that time, a massive fire had devastated the city, and the Roman emperor blamed the Christians, so Peter was arrested and sentenced to death. Since he wasn't a Roman citizen, he was condemned to crucifixion, but at 65 years old, Peter said he didn't want to die the same way as Jesus. He requested to be crucified upside down, and that's exactly what they did. Just a few hours later, he was already meeting his boss in the lobby. If you want to visit him today, his remains are believed to lie beneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, inside a box labeled, "Peter is here." Interestingly, his feet are missing. Romans often cut them off to make it easier to remove upside-down bodies from the cross. Next is Andrew, Peter's brother. He went to preach in Greece, but authorities saw Christians as a dangerous sect. After all, the locals already had their own lineup of gods: Zeus, Apollo, and the rest. So, crucifixion again. But since copying Jesus' execution seemed a bit too on the nose, they put Andrew on an X-shaped cross instead. He hung there for 2 days before finally dying from exhaustion at age 65. He was buried in Patras, Greece. Today, only a finger and part of his skull remain there. The rest of his body was taken by crusaders to Amalfi, Italy. Fun fact: St. Andrew's cross later inspired the famous Burgundian cross. Now let's talk about James the Greater. He stayed in Jerusalem spreading Christianity until King Herod arrested him to win favor with Jewish leaders. Without much ceremony, James was beheaded with a sword at age 45. Afraid his body might be desecrated, 2 loyal followers placed it in a stone boat and sailed across the Mediterranean until they reached Galicia in Spain. He was buried in a nearby forest until, centuries later, a hermit discovered the tomb. His remains were moved to Santiago, where the famous Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela now stands. Then we have James the Lesser. He also remained in Jerusalem and became a major leader among Christians. But the high priest despised him because conversions were rising fast. They brought him to the top of the temple and demanded, "Publicly deny Jesus." James, at 63, refused. So, a little push. He fell more than 100 feet, slammed into the ground, and somehow survived. Barely alive but still conscious, the crowd began throwing stones at him. Still not enough. Finally, a temple worker grabbed a wooden club and crushed his skull. He was buried near the temple, but the exact location has been lost to history. Philip traveled through what is now Turkey, preaching successfully enough to convert the proconsul's own wife, something the Roman official did not appreciate. At 87 years old, Philip was stoned and then crucified. Even then, he kept preaching from the cross for days. Eventually, they took him down, but his body was too broken, and he died soon after. He was buried there, though during the Middle Ages his remains were reportedly moved to the Basilica of the Holy Apostles in Rome. Bartholomew had quite the missionary journey, from India to Armenia, where legend says he converted the king after resurrecting his children. Hard to argue with a miracle like that. Local priests were furious and pressured the king's brother to act. Bartholomew was ordered to renounce his faith. He refused. So they flayed him alive as he was literally peeling off his skin, and then beheaded him. He was about 50 years old. Though buried in Armenia, his relics were later scattered across Europe. His official tomb is in Rome at the Basilica of St. Bartholomew. Matthew, the former tax collector, meaning he probably didn't have many friends, traveled widely after Jesus' death. His ending is unclear, so pick your favorite version. Either he died of natural causes in Ethiopia, or he was killed in Iran while celebrating Mass, stabbed with a sword or spear because the king disliked Christianity. He likely died around age 60. Centuries later, his remains were moved to Salerno, Italy, where the Cathedral of St. Matthew now stands. Thomas traveled all the way to India and converted the king's wife. You can probably guess how that ended. The king got furious, and Thomas was pierced through the chest with a spear at age 65. He was buried there in what is now Chennai, where a cathedral was later built. They even claimed to preserve the spearhead that killed him. Jude, Thaddeus, and Simon preached together through Iraq and Iran. Local pagan leaders couldn't stand them, so one day they were captured. Jude was beaten to death with a club. Simon, standing right beside him, was sawed in half. Centuries later, their remains were moved to Rome, where they are believed to rest in St. Peter's Basilica. John, the brother of James the Greater, was captured in Turkey and taken to Rome. The emperor tried to execute him by throwing him into a massive pot of boiling oil in front of a crowd. But nothing happened. Imagine the shock. Convinced they couldn't kill him, they exiled him to the Greek island of Patmos. There, he experienced visions that led him to write the book of Revelation. Years later, he returned to Ephesus and died of old age at around 100. His tomb was placed inside a basilica that now lies in ruins, and the grave is empty. Tradition says his bones disappeared miraculously. And finally, Judas Iscariot, the traitor. In case you forgot, he betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, roughly the equivalent of a few $1,000s today. There are two main versions of his death. One says he was overcome with guilt, returned the money, and hanged himself. The other claims he bought a field and later fell headfirst onto a rock, splitting his body open. That place is still known today as the Field of Blood in Jerusalem. And unsurprisingly, he has no official tomb. But here's one last twist. In Islam, Jesus is considered one of the greatest prophets, but they do not believe he was crucified. Instead, some traditions say there was a last-minute substitution, and the Romans executed Judas, who supposedly resembled him, while God raised Jesus to heaven unharmed. And there you have it, my friend. The deaths of Jesus' apostles. Now tell me, which one shocked you the most?